You're tuned to The Score on donor-powered CKUA. I'm your host, Oskar Zybart. Ariodante is an opera seria in 3 acts composed by George Friedrich Handel. The story is a melodrama in Scotland involving royal marriage, trickery, betrayal, and reunification. The piece made its stage debut in London in 1735 and was performed nearly a dozen times in that initial season before falling into obscurity until it found a new life in the 1970s and has since come to be considered amongst Handel's best-loved operas. This weekend, Chamber Muse partners with Early Music Voices for performances of Ariodante at Knox United Church in Calgary, and joining them for this performance as guest conductor is internationally acclaimed harpsichordist Hank Knox from Montreal. So joining me to discuss the piece, the performance, and the harpsichord is Hank Knox. Welcome, Hank.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you're coming to Calgary as guest conductor of Ariodante. Have you collaborated previously with Chamber Muse or Early Music Voices before?
No, this is the first time, and I think it's the first opportunity I've had to work with Calgary musicians, Alberta musicians, on an early music project. Early Music Voices is dedicated to the performance of early repertoire, so from 1750 on back, using the kinds of vocal production styles, ornaments, instruments that are appropriate for the repertoire of the period. So it's a specialized organization on its own. They've been running for some 25 years now, and this is kind of a celebratory event for them. All of the vocal talent is all from Calgary. So this is an opportunity to hear some of the fine musicians that you have here in Calgary on stage, and a great work of art. And what's really quite remarkable is the marriage of these two groups and how well they fit together. It says I'm conducting, which sounds very official and formal, like I'm going to be standing there with a baton and a long coat or something like that. But in fact, I'm going to be ringleading from the harpsichord. I'll be playing most of the time and waving my hands around every once in a while when I need to exert a little bit more control over the proceedings.
What can you tell us about the instrument you'll be playing for this performance? Is it one that you've worked with before?
No. Life as a traveling harpsichordist means that you get to meet different instruments everywhere you go. Every time it's a little bit different. For this performance, there are actually 2 of us who will be playing harpsichord. Handel often had a second keyboard player. And I'll be working with Justin Lushinsky, who's one of the co-artistic directors of Chamber Muse. I think originally the idea was to do this as a completely staged production, but stage productions are notoriously expensive and difficult to organize. And I think for a fledgling ensemble, it was simpler to go ahead with a concert production. So the 2 of us will be managing the continuo duties from dueling harpsichords face to face in the middle of the stage.
What is it that first drew you to the instrument?
That's a really good question. I started life playing piano. I started when I was like 8 or 9, 7 or 8 actually, very, very young. While I loved playing music, I never really liked playing scales and arpeggios. At some point, I drifted over to playing the organ. And while I was in high school, my organ teacher said, well, the person who built the organ that we're on is actually looking for somebody to help in his shop. And I was living in the United States then. And I wrote to the organ builder in Quebec who was looking for help. And I said, well, my organ teacher thinks that you might be able to use a monkey to drill holes. And he said, well, yes, I think we could do that. I can't imagine that you could get a job like that anymore on the basis of a phone call. But on the basis of that, I moved to Canada back in 1972, and I've never looked back. At some point, I decided building organs was really not what I was cut out to do in this world. I don't have any particular flair for working with wood. I greatly admire those who do, but that's not me. And so I decided, well, I like to play music. Maybe I should go back to school. So I auditioned to go to school at McGill. But because I really hadn't done an awful lot of focus study on any particular instrument, I decided to start my career in music as a music theorist. But you still have to take an instrument. And somebody said, well, the harpsichord is a nice instrument if you're interested in theory. And I thought, yeah, sure, why not? What can go wrong? After the first semester, I realized I love the sound of this instrument and I love the repertoire. And yes, you have to do technical exercises, but you don't have to do a lot of scales and arpeggios, which pleased me no end. And I've been doing it ever since.
So you went from the instrument that can sustain forever to one that barely sustains at all.
Barely sustains at all, but it's still got a beautiful singing voice. It's just a different way of making it work.
And do you find that voice remains a relevant one in the keyboard music of today, or is it primarily a sound that's bound to a fixed period of music that's long past in your mind?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have a convincing answer for it, but the repertoire that the harpsichord engendered, if you like, speaks to me, and it still speaks to me, and I think there's a lot about it that speaks to the current age. A lot of the music that you have to accompany as a harpsichordist is vocal music, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And that stuff is all about very, very human emotions that still remain valid, legitimate, and in everybody's minds, hearts, and tongues today. So like the opera we're doing, this is all about love and its complications, about the things that make it feel great, the things that make it feel bad, the things we do to each other to make love complicated, and how it all wins out in the end. There's nothing that's not the least bit contemporary about those particular emotions and situations. So the harpsichord still has a place expressing those things in music of the past. Is there a lot of contemporary music for harpsichord? There is some. It's not stuff that I've spent a lot of time with, although I respect a lot of the people who do play contemporary music. It's certainly not at the forefront of concert going experience to go to a concert of all contemporary harpsichord music. But in my mind, there's no reason why it couldn't be.
Now, I know you've performed and recorded music of Handel before. How do you rate Ariodante compared with Handel's other works, both from the perspective of a player and that as a conductor?
So Handel wrote a large number of operas, and it happens that when I was working at McGill, we staged an early opera almost every year that I was there, and I did over 20 of them, maybe 25. Many of them were Handel operas. So I've done a large swath of the Handel catalog. And Ariodante, in my opinion, is one of the strongest and most coherent of the stories and has some of the best sets of arias. Ariodante, I think, is really kind of a perfect construction. You won't hear the harpsichord all by itself. The harpsichord will be part of a chamber orchestra. We've got violins, cellos, oboes, bassoons, the kind of standard Handelian orchestra that Handel would have had. And in a context like this, the harpsichord is the fundamental component of it, where we play the bass line the same as the cellos and the bassoons, and Handel gives us numbers on top of the notated bass line that say, play this chord here. But it's a little bit like jazz. Yes, you know what chord you're supposed to play, but it doesn't tell you how many notes to play. It doesn't tell you how to voice it. Doesn't tell you how to link it up to the next chord. Doesn't tell you how to flesh it out. So Justin and I will be improvising our own accompaniment parts live on stage. You have to listen because it's not something that sticks out particularly, but we'll be back there filling out the texture. And in the recitatives, we'll be establishing the emotional background to the scene while the characters tell the story in the recitatives.
But that's fantastic, because that, of course, sets the performance as a unique entity where it will not necessarily be identical to any other performance that anyone might have seen before.
That's the part that we really like, is that every time you walk out on stage, it's going to be a little bit different. And the singers will be doing that as well. These are all da capo arias. That means that you sing through the first part of the aria more or less as it's written on the page, as Handel wrote it down. There's a second part of the aria which might have contrasting material, might have a different emotion, but then it goes back to the top. Chamber Muse is dedicated to the use of historically accurate instruments. So we'll have Baroque violins, Baroque violas, Baroque cellos, we have Baroque oboes. So it's a sound that's not exactly like what you would hear from a modern orchestra or modern strings. It comes closer to reproducing what Handel would have heard in the theater in the 1730s.
After the Calgary performances, you'll be continuing on the road with stops in the near future, both in Boston and in Toronto. And some of these stops include performances of work by Johann Sebastian Bach. Do you find it difficult to shift between the emotional headspaces separating a Handel opera and Bach's keyboard works?
Difficult? No. Challenging? Yes, sometimes. They're very different personalities. Handel was a very public, very flamboyant figure working in theater in a major metropolitan center. Bach was a church musician in a relatively remote part of Germany. They're both equally powerful as purveyors of text. You watch the way either of them sets a particular text, and every single time it's amazing the resources that they bring to bear and the effects that they manage to produce with their writing. It's one of the things that allows somebody to have a very long career, is that there's so much stuff to discover and so many ways to think about it that you're constantly exploring new ways to say things.
Chamber Muse and Early Music Voices present Handel's Ariodante at Knox United Church in Calgary on April 13th, featuring Hank Knox as performer and guest conductor. To learn more, visit the events calendar at CKUA.com. Hank Knox, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Oskar. This was great.